Hello. It was a time for all men to come to the aid of the party. Money changers, too, were welcome back into the temple of the revolution.
This is a capitalism we must and can accept, but to which we can and must assign certain limits. For it is necessary to the great mass of the peasantry and to the trade that enables the peasants' needs to be satisfied. We must arrange things in such a way that the regular operation of the economy and the patterns of exchange characteristic of capitalism become possible. It must be so for the sake of the people. Otherwise, we should not be able to live.
One of the greatest U-turns in economic history when Lenin led the Bolsheviks back to a kind of capitalism after civil war had put Russia on the ropes. We'll be counting out Lenin's new economic policy, which Mikhail Gorbachev argued might save the party once again. But post-perestroika, Russia, it seems, is looking back to an earlier period of reform for the way ahead. We'll be walking the good Russian earth from the freeing of the serfs to Stalin's forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture in the company of John Channon, and remembering a prime minister who had trouble with his parliaments nearly 90 years before Boris Yeltsin moved against the White House. Then it was the Duma, Imperial Russia's first attempt at an elected assembly.
St. George's Hall, the throne room, presented a queer spectacle at this moment, and I believe its walls had never before witnessed such a scene. The left side was crowded with the members of the Duma, a small number of whom had appeared in full dress, while the overwhelming majority, occupying the first places near the throne, were dressed, as if intentionally, in workers' blouses and cotton shirts. Naively believing that the people's representatives, many of whom were peasants, would be awed by the splendor of the imperial court, the ladies of the imperial family had worn nearly all their jewels. This Oriental method of impressing upon spectators a reverence for the bearers of supreme power was quite unsuited to the occasion. What it did achieve was to set in juxtaposition the boundless imperial luxury and the poverty of the people.
The Russian people had won their first parliament, the Duma, after the abortive revolution of 1905, a railway strike across the empire, and the founding of a Soviet of workers in St. Petersburg forced the autocrat of all the Russias to unclench his fist. But only for a matter of months. The first Duma was dissolved, and the last Tsar's last reforming prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, ruled by royal decree. A second and a third Duma went the way of the first, and the constitution too was tinkered with to give conservatives an advantage. Yet the cause of reform, particularly on the land, was close to Stolypin's heart. Robert Service, professor of Russian history and politics at the University of London, explains this apparent paradox.
Whoever was to lead the government on behalf of the Tsar had to be a man of great ferocity and administrative efficiency. So, in turning to Stolypin, the Tsar Nicholas II knew what kind of man he was turning to, a man who could wield the big stick, or as the Russians would have it, the knout. But he also had to be a man of imagination, and Stolypin had that imagination. He saw very clearly that a new kind of Russia had to be constructed. It wasn't enough calling a new assembly, a new parliament, a new Duma. It was also absolutely vital that the agrarian order in Russia was rebuilt. But he also wanted to change the way that society conducted its affairs. He set up, therefore, local administrative councils to which the peasants could be elected. He ensured that the fundamental laws that were introduced for the first time in 1906 gave certain civil rights to the peasants. He wanted Russian peasants to be proud of being Russian.
Stolypin, says Robert Service, combined administrative ruthlessness with a deeply conservative political imagination. Yet even he understood that Russia could no longer be ruled in the autocratic manner of the past. A reformed society, even if reformed along conservative lines, would require a fair measure of public discussion. There would have to be political parties and a free press.
And so he played cat and mouse with the press, sometimes allowing the expression of opinion, sometimes closing down newspapers and arresting their editors. He played cat and mouse even with the revolutionary parties because, after all, Lenin's party in 1907, as Lenin was leaving for Finland, had its representatives in the State Duma. So that even a political party dedicated to the violent overthrow of Stolypin's sovereign, Nicholas II, was allowed to exist. But it was only allowed to exist so long as it didn't say quite openly what it intended to do to Stolypin and to Nicholas II.
To what extent were Stolypin's hands tied by the fact that he was the Tsar's first minister?
Nicholas II was closely related to Wilhelm II in Germany. And Wilhelm II in Germany had had enough problems with Otto von Bismarck for Nicholas II to be aware as to what the dangers might be if Pyotr Stolypin got out of hand and started ruling the country as if it were his own. Now, this made for a very, very tricky relationship of powers between the emperor and his first minister, and it ground Stolypin down. Stolypin was a handsome man. He was a tough man. He was a man with a ruthless past. He was a man with a vision for the future. He knew that it would take decades for his political and agrarian vision to take root in Russian reality. And it was persistently a problem for Stolypin that he, Stolypin, was not Tsar.
What is there to be said for the 1907 constitution that Stolypin endeavours to introduce?
The reason that he manipulated the rules governing elections in 1907 were simple. The first State Duma and the second State Duma had not produced the kind of parliamentary opinion that he wanted. So he quite shamelessly gerrymandered the rules so as to produce a supinely conservative and pro-governmental Duma in the third of its manifestations. It didn't really work very well for him because the allies that he formed extracted compromises, particularly over procedure, ironically enough, not so much over the substance of policy, but over the procedures governing how laws came into effect. The deals that he did over procedures, though, in the years of the Third State Duma from 1907 onwards, got him into hot water with the Imperial Council, wherein sat all the most reactionary elements of the traditional Russian state, all the dowager duchesses and grand dukes, bishops, patriarchs, all of the representatives of 19th century Russia wanting to take Russia back to the 17th century. They were all in that state council waiting to slit the political throat of Stolypin.
On September the 14th, 1911, Stolypin was in Kiev with the Tsar. In the evening, they attended the opera. Stolypin and many of his ministers in the stalls, Nicholas II in the royal box with two of his daughters. Also in the audience, Dmitry Bagrov, a well-known revolutionary. Later, the Tsar would describe what happened in a letter to his mother.
During the second interval, we had just left the box, as it was so hot, when we heard two sounds, as if something had been dropped. I thought an opera glass might have fallen on somebody's head and ran back into the box to look. To the right, I saw a group of officers and other people. They seemed to be dragging someone along. Women were shrieking, and directly in front of me in the stalls, Stolypin was standing. He slowly turned his face towards us, and with his left hand made the sign of the cross in the air. Only then did I notice that he was very pale and that his right hand and uniform were blood-stained. He slowly sank into the chair and began to unbutton his tunic. While Stolypin was being helped out of the theatre, there was a great noise in the corridor near our box. People were trying to lynch the assassin. Then the theatre filled up again, the national anthem was sung, and I left with the girls at 11. You can imagine with what emotions.
The suspicion was very strong that Bagrov had been allowed to get near to do the shooting with the connivance of the Russian security police. There were even rumours that the Tsar himself had known in advance that an attempt would be made on the life of Stolypin.
As Russians reconsider their history, they may be tempted to draw comparisons between Pyotr Stolypin and now Boris Yeltsin. Both men sought constitutional reform. Both grew impatient with their parliaments. Both were ambivalent about the free press. But, says Robert Service, the differences between the two men are quite as striking as the similarities.
Yeltsin was elected president. He's the equivalent of an elected Tsar. Stolypin was the appointee of the Tsar. Yeltsin has the legitimacy of election behind him. Stolypin always had to go running for legitimacy to the Tsar. And that was always difficult to obtain, because not only had the Tsar to give his agreement to everything, but also Stolypin was, through the Ministry of Internal Affairs, killing lots of Russians by hanging them at field courts-martial. After all, the hangman's noose in Stolypin's day was known as Stolypin's necktie.
Robert Service and the brief and often brutal career of Pyotr Stolypin. Stolypin first caught the Tsar's eye when appointed a provincial governor at the turn of the century. In Grodno and then Saratov, he'd shown a measure of concern for the welfare of the peasants, striving to improve their legal and their economic status, while simultaneously keeping the countryside in its place if rebellion threatened. Russia, agricultural, not yet industrial, had only turned its back on ancient feudalism in the 1860s, and the freeing of the serfs announced a time of reform on the land, described for me by Dr. John Channon of the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in the University of London. He's recently returned from St. Petersburg, where he's been researching Russian agriculture.
The emancipation of the serfs essentially made individual peasants free men, but at the same time it did grant them an allotment of land, and this allotment of land they held right through to the Revolution of 1917. The second land reform would be after the 1905 revolution, which was introduced by the then Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, and this land reform essentially attempted to break up the old village communities and to introduce a new individual type of family farmstead farming.
And how much land might the peasants have actually owned as families?
I think the problem in Russian rural history is the difficulty of the concept of ownership. From 1861 and the emancipation of the serfs, most of the land was actually held by village communities. Very, very little land was actually in the hands of individual peasants, although within the peasant communities, the village communities, each household was allocated some strips of land. The peasant customary law that existed and basically conditioned the way in which peasants understood farming had no understanding at all of Western private property. And it was really only on the Western borderlands, those areas closest to Finland, the Baltics, and closer, if you like, to Western Europe with traditions of private ownership and family farming, that we actually find any peasants really with these concepts of private ownership.
Private ownership of any kind was anathema to the Bolsheviks when they seized power in Russia in 1917 and set about creating the Soviet Union. And while Lenin, as a dutiful disciple of Karl Marx, believed that it was the urban industrial working class who would and should be in the vanguard of the revolution, there had been long discussions amongst the Bolsheviks about the peasantry and how the revolution would set about land reform.
The plans that they had laid for agricultural reform were clearly quite different from the first land reform that was introduced after the October Revolution. The so-called October Land Decree, introduced by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, was a very much watered-down version of what most Bolsheviks would have expected from their discussions and plans beforehand. There was no talk immediately of socialist cultivation, socialist agriculture. It was very much, if you like, a sop to the peasants, quite clearly because the Bolsheviks realized that they needed peasant support. It's actually sanctioning a process that had already been in motion for several months. Peasants had been gradually moving on to landowners' estates, negotiating with the bailiffs or stewards if the landowners weren't there, and had gradually assumed control of these.
Between 1919 and 22, Russia experienced a devastating civil war as the Bolsheviks sought to establish their authority throughout the country. And armies, red quite as much as white, march on their stomachs. Feeding the men in uniform and civilians behind the front lines became a priority for the revolutionary government, with important consequences for the peasants on the land when Lenin was able to claim the victory.
What the Civil War did more than anything else, particularly under the Bolsheviks, with the new burdens that had been imposed on the peasantry, the forceful requisitioning of grain and other products, meant that the peasants themselves became more isolationist. And the decentralization in the economy that had been developing from the early years of the First World War simply continued. And it actually made it far more difficult now for the Bolsheviks to try and acquire food for the towns and the armies. And we have to remember that the Bolsheviks were essentially an urban party. They had very little contact with the peasantry before the revolution. And it's perhaps one of the difficulties of an urban-based party seizing power in a country where the vast majority of the people are peasants living in the countryside.
One result of the Civil War, it's often said, is that Lenin was forced to make a kind of political and indeed an economic U-turn in order to help the reconstruction of a country that had been through this civil war, the so-called NEP. This clearly applies to the industrial part of the Russian economy. Were there also consequences in terms of what happened on the land as a result of the NEP?
Yes, I think most commentators, actually, of the Russian scene would argue that the new economic policy itself was very much a peasant policy. It was very much forced on the Bolshevik government. The peasant uprisings that had been developing from the summer of 1920 right through the winter of 1920-21 clearly now had greatly worried the Bolshevik Party. And we can see in the early months of 1921, not just Lenin, but other leading members of the Bolshevik Party trying to work their way towards a new solution to the peasant question.
Lenin died in 1924, and within 4 years, Joseph Stalin had established his complete authority over the Communist Party. Stalin had his own plans for land reform. As a loyal Bolshevik, he was convinced that the new economic policy had helped to encourage a new class system on the land, and the way to eradicate it was the enforced collectivization of all Soviet agriculture. Within 3 years, the nation experienced a great famine, the greatest in Russia's history. No one is certain how many people died as a result of collectivization and the famine that followed in its shadow, perhaps as many as 13 million. But if, as an earlier generation of historians have suggested, this was all Stalin's doing, he also had help from his party friends.
More recently, historians have begun to reassess collectivization. And what many of them have shown is that there was, in fact, a movement from below. There was, in fact, a radical movement amongst the urban workers who were fearing famine, who feared food shortages. a movement certainly amongst lower-level party figures. And if anything, it wasn't Stalin alone. It was Stalin perhaps linking up with other bases of social support. And Stalin himself wasn't, of course, the first one to start talking about force being used against the kulaks, who were, as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned, a stratum of rich, wealthy peasants. The so-called liquidation of the kulaks, dekulakization, or all-out collectivization. If anything, he was following a trend that had been developing in the last years of the 1920s.
As Russia thinks once again of land reform, moves into perhaps an era of privatization, are they looking back on aspects of this history to teach them ways that might lead them ahead?
Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and certainly since the emergence, if you like, of the new Russia, and the emergence also of an attempt at the privatization of agriculture, what I think we have seen there is a deliberate harking back to the past, not the past of the early post-revolutionary years, but the past of the pre-revolutionary period, the period of the Stolypin reforms, the period when there was an attempt to break up, if you like, the communal or collective peasant system and to introduce a system of private peasant ownership, of private property, of small family farms. Clearly, this now has a historic resonance when we are talking about the emergence of new private farms in Russia today. And this, it seems to me, is why there is so much enthusiasm about this period of the Stolypin reforms.
All routes to present reform, it seems, lead back to Pyotr Stolypin. I was talking to John Channon. After Stolypin, a world war, and then the October Revolution. After revolution, a civil war, the union of Soviet socialist republics, and perhaps heaven on earth. But paradise was about to be postponed.
We must not count on going straight to communism. We must build on the basis of the peasant's personal initiative.
Lenin backtracked the Bolshevik Revolution in 1921. At the 10th Party Congress, he announced a new economic policy, the NEP. In effect, a kind of state capitalism designed to revive a socialist economy mortally wounded during the Civil War and now all but ready for the undertaker thanks to a chronic shortage of manufactured goods. It was the peasants' refusal to exchange what they grew on the land for worthless Soviet paper that had provoked this latest crisis. Russian agriculture, which before the First World War had exported more wheat than the United States, was about to collapse. A collapse which threatened the very existence of the new Soviet state. Dominic Lieven, professor of Russian government at the London School of Economics, explains the background to Lenin's new economic policy.
They went over to the so-called new economic policy for political reasons more than anything else. In March 1921, the Bolshevik regime looked on the edge of collapse. You have to remember that this is the month of the famous Kronstadt Rising. The Kronstadt sailors, the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, were the cream of the revolution, in some ways in 1917 more Bolshevik than Lenin himself. If they were revolting against the regime in the name of all power to the Soviets, then obviously the communists were in trouble. And at the same time you had major strikes in the cities because there was no food. And Lenin, quite rightly from his own perspective, decides that things can't go on like this and that you have to get the economy on its feet again if the cities are not going to become completely emptied, and if indeed the regime's most loyal supporters are not going to turn against it. So he institutes NEP. The market is only going to work in agriculture and in small-scale industrial production and small-scale trade. The state retains its monopoly over foreign trade. It tries to ensure that peasants can't employ paid labor. It ensures that the state controls banking and that it controls heavy industry, the so-called commanding heights of the economy. But within those parameters, it simply allows a capitalist economy to re-establish itself.
Lenin's version of capitalism required the peasants to surrender a certain proportion of what they produced on the land to the state, a kind of secular tithe. The remainder they could barter or sell on a free market. That was no business of the state.
They taxed agricultural production and, through this means, invested in industry fundamentally. They also controlled industrial prices, since heavy industry anyway, and much indeed of industry, was state-managed, and as a result of that were in a sense able to carry out a double taxation policy in the sense that they could set the prices for the goods that the agricultural population wished to buy. It was extremely successful, at least in terms of the years we can judge by, the 1920s. You got production back to pre-revolutionary levels, both in industry and in agriculture. What you could not do was restore the old grain surpluses for export, because those surpluses had come, on the whole, from the larger peasant farms and from the bigger states. And it was precisely that sector of the economy, the agricultural economy, which the revolution had destroyed.
There were Bolsheviks, true believers in the revolution, whose faith in a communist future was almost destroyed by the new economic policy. Socialism, they argued, was being traded for a mess of capitalist pottage.
It was unacceptable in emotional terms, in the sense that many of these people felt, as a result of the revolution and victory in the Civil War, that they were on the verge of creating socialism. And quite obviously NEP was a retreat. Lenin accepted that it was a retreat, but you couldn't disguise the fact. And I think it was also thoroughly unacceptable because of its long-term political implications. After all, NEP meant depending on small-scale capitalist farmers in a country in which the overwhelming majority of the population were still peasants, and in which the Communist Party was really a very small minority, which had never sought or gained public consent to its rule. And therefore, from the point of view of ideological purists, and indeed of hard-headed party politicians, it was very easy to fear that what you were doing under NEP was strengthening precisely those groups in the population who would be hostile to socialism and hostile to the party.
No one was more hostile to the NEP than Joseph Stalin. And once Lenin was dead and Stalin had consolidated his position in the party, putting all serious rivals to flight, he set about returning the Soviet Union to his version of the communist straight and narrow.
Stalin interpreted the peasants' unwillingness to market grain at prices which the state had set, not in the normal way that you'd interpret that in the West now. In other words, this is simply a question of economic bargaining, supply and demand. On the contrary, he interpreted it as a political strike by the richer peasants against the state. And I think, as was his way, he responded very brutally to what he saw as this challenge. And he decided that he was going to really return to war communism. In other words, the system of 1918, 1919, 1920 forced the peasants really to become workers or serfs, if you like, in state-run, great landed estates. Forced them to work at the wages and in the conditions which the state itself determined. And that really is the meaning of collectivization. It was a ghastly mistake in the end, because although in principle what you were doing was pumping resources out of agriculture into industry, in fact, Stalin made such a mess of his policy of collectivization that the state had to invest huge sums in agriculture, for instance in tractors or simply in guards and administrative personnel to protect the crops from angry peasants. And as a result of that, it's, I think, almost certainly the case that the state, far from pumping resources out of agriculture, if you look at things in statistical terms, actually had to put in more than it took out. The areas where the population suffered most heavily were often non-Russian ones. Something like a third to a quarter of all Kazakh households, this is in what's now Kazakhstan in sort of Central Asia, disappeared in the course of 18 months under Stalin. 5 million Ukrainian peasants were starved to death deliberately during collectivization. And those memories are not forgotten.
Dominic Lieven was discussing the new economic policy ordained by Lenin, principal theologian to the Russian Revolution.